Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Putul Sathe, Associate Professor from Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. The title of the module which we are going to discuss today is Introduction to Feminist Theories Part 2. The learning objectives are to introduce the different theoretical positions in feminist thought. Second, to enable students to understand the complexity of feminist debates. And third, to understand gender as a fluid social cultural construction. Structure, introduction, psychoanalytic feminism, French feminism, postmodern feminism, and finally the summary. Introduction. This module will be a survey of various theoretical positions which try to understand different sides of women's oppression towards the end of the 20th century. During this period, many groundbreaking theories emerged independent of each other from different locations, making it difficult to talk about feminism in singular. There was a shift from the earlier focus on consciousness raising, where feminist political theory was in response to women's private experiences and emotions, and concentrated on issues like family, household work, wages, and sexual division of labor. However, from the 1970s onwards, feminism emerged as a site of contested meanings and strategies, and was increasingly problematized by the amount of feminist text that emerged and shrank rapidly out of print, while others survived and became landmarks in feminist thought. Psychoanalytic feminism. Psychoanalytic feminism has tried to provide an explanation for women's oppression by probe the depth of women's psyche, quote, in order to kill the original primal father from it, unquote. Freud has been criticized by the radical feminist for his attribution of female inferiority to her lack of penis. The concept of penis envy was seen as a symbol of male egocentrism. However, various psychoanalytic schools have developed Freudian concepts in various feminist directions. One school of psychoanalytic feminism has rejected biological determination and has argued that experience and cultural influence shaped a woman's gender identity and her behavior. Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, and Claire Thompson have argued that sexuality is socially constructed. They have offered a psychoanalytic as well as a political analysis of women's situation. They have advocated creativity, activity, and growth as gender blind, and they conceive the self as something which grew out of the interaction between nature and culture, and according to them, there was no one universal male or female self, rather there were many selves. The second school, consisting of Dorothy Dynastine and Nancy Chodorow, focused on the pre-Oedipal stage of psychosexual development as the key to understanding how sexuality and gender were constructed and how they have contributed to the construction of male domination. Dynastine in The Mermaid and the Minotaur has identified 6 destructive gender arrangements which resulted from women's role in child rearing. They were women's acceptance of men's sexual possessiveness, the muting of female erotic impulses, the idea that sexual excitement and personal sentiment must be tied together for women, women being denied personhood and viewed as its as opposed to men who were seen as I, central ambivalence towards flesh, and finally, women confined to the private world and men seeking the public world. Dynastine has held this gender construction responsible for our tendency to blame mother or women for everything that went wrong with human situation and also for our limitations as human beings. Nancy Chodorow, in Reproduction of Mothering, Psychoanalysis and the Sociology of Gender, has tried to demolish the myth that women were destined by nature to be mothers and that women were conditioned to be mothers. According to her, femininity is not a way of being that a girl deliberately decides to assume. Rather, it is a slow, gradual process that seizes the psyche of a girl before she is self-consciously aware of herself as a girl. The psychosexual development of boys and girls had its social implications. The fact of the boy being separated from his mother influenced his inability to relate deeply to others, and this in turn prepares him for his functioning in the public sphere. Similarly, the girl, because of her oneness with her mother, matures in her role as a nurturant wife and mother in the private sphere. So, Dynastine and Chodorow's solution to the oppression of women was to institutionalize dual parenting. Juliette Michel, in her book Psychoanalysis and Feminism, had demonstrated how Oedipus complex explained the transition from mere biological being to social being. Michel agreed with Freud that Oedipus' situation was universal, which meant that without prohibition of incest, human society was impossible. She has borrowed from Lévi-Strauss his explanation of the incest taboo and the forbidding of sexual relations within the family, leading to the exchange system among biological families, especially the exchange of women. The laws for the exchange of women were present in our unconscious, and it surfaced during the individual's painful resolution of the Oedipus complex. Michel points out that it assumed different forms of expression under different social and economic systems. And in advanced capitalist system, these exchange took place within the nuclear family. But in quote, economically advanced societies, though the kinship exchange system still operates in a residual manner, other forms of exchange, that is commodity exchange, dominate, and class and not kinship structures prevail. It would seem that it is against a background of the remoteness of a kinship system that the ideology of the biological family comes on its own. In other words, the relationship between two parents and their children assumes a dominant role when the complexity of a class forces the kinship system to recede, unquote. The only positive feature of this system, according to Michel, was that it made clear the social non-necessity of patriarchy, because the construction of society no longer depended on men exchanging women. This school of thought sought an answer to women's subordination by probing into the construction of sexual behavior, mothering, and moral conduct. However, legal, political, and economic institutions were not taken into account. The next school is the French school. The French feminist school of thought, represented by Helena Cixous, Louise Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva, will challenge gender construction not in terms of understanding women as real biological entities who at this point in history are united in terms of shared experience of oppression, but as Alice Jardine has pointed out, as the writing effect. Quote, when the French talk of la écriture féminine, they do not mean the tradition of women's writing that Woolf and Showalter have labored to uncover, but a certain mode of writing which unsettles fixed meanings. On the other hand, when Anglo-Americans use the term feminine, they are usually referring to that cultural stereotype which patriarchy tells us in the appropriate, even natural form of behavior for women. Though both gynesis and gynocriticism would agree that master narratives are bankrupt, gynesis does not want to substitute mistress narratives. Therefore, Guinness gives no special emphasis to female authors and characters. Most of the examples of feminine writing it considers are by men. It is not necessarily preoccupied with women's groups. On the contrary, Jardine stresses the location that concerns Guinness is space and absence. In Guinness's belief, the individual as a fully rational, secure identity gives way to a subject which is unstable and constantly reformed. Kristeva uses the phrase subject in process to convey how our identities in life are constantly called into question, brought to trial over rules. Unquote. Helena Sixou, in her essay Sorties, describes the political economy of masculine and feminine, which governs the solidarity of logocentrism and phallocentrism. Quote, the political economy of the masculine and the feminine is organized by different requirements and constraints which, when socialized and metaphorized, produce signs, relationships of power, relationships of production and of reproduction, an entire immense system of cultural inscription readable as masculine or feminine. Unquote. French feminists tried to understand phallocentrism as a discursive practice where the two sexes have been subsumed into a singular universal model which is the masculine. By trying to understand what E. A. Gross in her essay The Intervention of Feminist Knowledge has described as masculinity of knowledge, feminists can deconstruct phallocentric paradigms of truth, reason, logic, meaning and being, and thus claim space for women. This school believed that Western thought has been based on a systematic repression of women's experience and her body. Therefore, their assertion of feminine is to challenge Western culture, which is fundamentally phallocentric. Quote, I am unified, self-controlled, center of the universe man, white, European and ruling class has been claimed. The rest of the world, which I define as the other, her meaning only in relation to me as man, father, possessor of the phallus, unquote. Écriture feminine is a position where resistance to phallo-logocentric concepts takes place in the form of jouissance, that is, quote, in the direct re-experience of the physical pleasures of infancy and of later sexuality, repressed but not obliterated by the law of the father, unquote. Julia Kristeva finds jouissance, which results in constructing text against the rules and regularities of conventional language, which results in semiotic liberation. Kristeva has defined semiotic discourse as, quote, an incestuous challenge to the symbolic order, asserting as it does the writer's return to the pleasure of his pre-verbal identification with his mother and his refusal to identify with his father and the logic of paternal discourse, unquote. Kristeva finds liberatory potentials in the marginalized position of the woman who, on account of the position, will not produce a fixed authority claiming subject speaker of the language. Women for Kristeva represents not, quote, so much a sex as an attitude, any resistance to conventional culture and language meant to have access to the jouissance that opposes phallo-logocentrism, unquote. Acknowledging the efforts of the previous feminist theories to invoke the term woman to understand the oppression of women and improve their lot, Kristeva's use of the term marked a departure because, according to her, the term should be invoked to create a, quote, politics of liberation, unquote, and not to produce a, quote, politics of exclusion and counter power, unquote. Luce Iraguirre, on the contrary, offers the viewpoint that women are different from men and because they have been caught in the world structured by men-centered concepts and have no way of knowing or representing themselves. Hence, she offers female self-consciousness as the starting point through women's bodies and women's sexual pleasure because they have been misrepresented in male discourse. She argues further that female sexuality explains women's problematic relationship to masculine logic and language. According to Irigaray, it is not only women's discovery of their autoeroticism which will enable them to transform the existing order, but also analyze the various systems that oppresses them. Helena Sixou's position is based on a conviction that the quote psychosexual specificities unquote of women will empower women to overthrow masculinist viewpoint. In her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, which is the manifesto of La Écriture Féminine, which is a separate writing stroke language metaphorically based on women's physical experience of sexuality. Quote, the new history is coming, it is not a dream, though it does extend beyond men's imagination and for good reason. It is going to deprive them of their conceptual orthopedics, beginning with the destruction of the enticement machine. It is impossible to define a feminine practice of writing, and this is an impossibility that will remain, for this practice can never be theorized, enclosed, coded, which does not mean that it does not exist, unquote. Writing in the feminine is therefore a position, and a feminine text is more than subversive. Quote, it is volcanic. As it is written, it brings about an upheaval of the old property crust, carriers of masculine investments, there is no other way, unquote. As a methodology for interrogation of gender construction, this school of thought is more concerned with the gender of the text than the gender of the author. This methodology will also deconstruct the masculine construction of man of reason and debunk the search for a unitary truth as a masculine effort. Écriture féminine will develop an alternative to androcentric narratives, and therefore the French feminists have been important in formulating the postmodern position. The next school of thought is postmodern feminism. Feminists entered the postmodern discourse by deconstructing notions of quote reason, knowledge or the self, and to reveal the effects of gender arrangements that lay beneath their neutral and universalizing trends, unquote. Postmodern feminists have problematized gender relations, and gender can no longer be considered as simple natural facts. Rather, it refers to the position one occupies in an ideological grid. This in turn has resulted in understanding the relations of domination in gender relations, whereby the woman is the other while men are universal. As Elizabeth Wright in her essay, Thoroughly Postmodern Feminist Criticism has pointed out, to the emergence of new frameworks whereby the diversity and contradiction between various positions and also within a particular position point to the contradictions within feminism. The subject position are always compromised positions where the subject position is always being reformed along various axes like gender, race, age and psyche, with some factor being reinforced at some point, and also factors are in conflict with each other. Cathy E. Ferguson has coined the term mobile subjects who trouble fixed boundaries, antagonize true believers, create new possibilities for themselves. They are ambiguous, messy and multiple, unstable but preserving. They are ironic, attentive to the manyness of things. They are politically difficult in their refusal to stick consistently to one stable identity or claim, unquote. A given subject position is always in a flux, transgressing various established paradigms of nature and culture, and represents a complex intersection of various discourses and represents a quote potential for endless possible permutation, unquote. Subject position represented through identity are political effects and are generated within the field of power. Postmodernism has had an impact on gender construction positions in terms of concentrating on the instability of all gender positions and provide a quote critique of consolidated identity, unquote. One's subject position is therefore deferred, and postmodernism does so by treating gender identities as non-normative and hence prone to dissonance and uncertainty, and hence undermines logocentric discourse. Teresa de Lauretis' understanding of gender moves beyond the limit of sexual difference and proposes the theory of technologies of gender and sexuality, producing and reproducing constructions and fictions with the potential power of truth, effects of representation. The multiplicity of discourses can also provide space for creation of new gender identities. This postmodern approach reflects the various contradiction in a particular position and the manner in which subjectivity is inscribed within the quote movement in and out of ideology, that crossing back and forth of the boundaries and of the limits of sexual differences, unquote. Gender, therefore, is fragile and provisional, an unstable sign and an act of signification. Negotiating with one's gendered identity is an ongoing process and in some measure unfinished and incomplete. There is a constant slipping in and out of one's gendered identity. The definition of masculinity and femininity have undergone change with changing ideological positions, and hence there are masculinities and feminities. Gender at any given historical time is simultaneously constructed across a range of discourses, and different constructions often contradict each other. There are different theories of gender which give rise to heterogeneous and multiple meanings, knowledge and biologies. Jane Flax, in her essay Postmodernism and Gender Relations in Feminist Theory, elucidates on this point, quote, gender relations are differentiated and so far asymmetric divisions and attributions of human traits and capacities. Through gender relations, two types of persons are created, man and woman. Men and women are posited as exclusive categories. One can be only one gender, never the other or both. The actual content of being a man or woman and the rigidity of the categories themselves are highly variable across cultures and time. Nevertheless, gender relations, so far as we have been able to understand them, have been more or less relations of domination. That is, gender relations have been more defined and imperfectly controlled by one of their interrelated aspects, the man, unquote. Gender relations as a category is meant to represent a complex set of social relations which keep on changing with social variables. Also, from the perspective of social relations, men and women are both prisoners of gender, and gender is constituted coherently across political and cultural intersections. Gender, which is also the cultural interpretation of sex, is not confined to this understanding. Judith Butler, in her essay Subjects of Sex, Gender, Desire, describes gender as a fluid one. Quote, gender ought not to be conceived merely as the critical inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex, a juridical conception. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. As a result, gender is not a culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive cultural means by which sex nature or a natural sex is produced and established as pre-discursive, prior to culture, a politically neutral surface on which culture acts, unquote. Sex and gender are therefore related not because one is natural while the other represents culture, but because both are cultural categories that refer to codes of perceiving and negotiating with human bodies and our relationship to ourselves and to others. French school of feminist thought and postmodernism has been criticized as feminism for academicians, and the theories are seen as opaque and lacking clarity. These schools have different agenda, and their agendas include, and quote, appreciation for the possibilities latent in nothingness, absence, the marginal, the peripheral and the repressed. Finally, in conclusion, we can say that the module has tried to map the shifting terrains in feminist political theory towards the end of the second wave. Potential for women's liberation was sought outside revolutionary struggles to questioning of psychosocial relations. Feminist political thought investigated various perspectives to understand gender operations in the society, and feminist theory was now governed by rich diversity and heterogeneity. Thank you.